The moment of crossing does not begin when a being appears in front of you. It begins when the world stops behaving like a sealed surface and starts acting like it has depth behind it. Until then, distance protected you. Lights could remain lights. Silence fields could remain anomalies. Pressure could remain internal. Crossing begins when the physical frame no longer holds as a complete explanation for what is happening around you. At first, the break is small enough to deny. A room feels too large for its walls. A doorway seems to hold more darkness than the structure should allow. The air acquires weight without weather changing, and your body notices before thought does. You do not feel like you are hallucinating. You feel like the environment has become less final. This is what makes the stage harder than sighting. A sighting leaves the world intact and adds an object to it. Crossing does something worse. It questions whether objects are the primary layer at all. The floor still exists, the furniture still exists, your body still exists. Yet all of it feels slightly provisional, as if matter is no longer the whole sentence. The mind immediately reaches for familiar repair: exhaustion, stress, adrenaline, eye strain, spatial disorientation. These explanations matter because they protect you from fantasy, but they also fail to account for the clean specificity of the event. Fatigue blurs, crossing sharpens, stress fragments, crossing concentrates. A true crossing event carries an unnatural precision. Edges do not dissolve into dream haze. They become more exact while also becoming less absolute. A corner of the room can feel more real than usual and less closed at the same time. This is the first insult to the ordinary mind, because ordinary perception assumes that clarity and closure belong together. Then movement changes. Not movement in the sky, not distant motion that can still be held at the edge of reason, movement inside the frame. A shift in peripheral awareness that does not behave like imagination and does not behave like an intruding body either. You do not see a person enter. You feel the architecture of the room acknowledge another order of presence. This is why many people freeze at the threshold of crossing. Not because they are weak, but because the body is built to orient by boundaries. And crossing destabilizes boundaries without fully removing them. If the walls vanished, panic would be simple. If a person clearly entered, recognition would be simple, but the crossing keeps the world mostly intact while exposing that mostly intact is not the same as secure. Time is altered differently here than in earlier stages. A threshold event may stretch a moment. Crossing changes sequence. You may feel that one instant arrived before the one that should have preceded it. You may turn and know before turning that something will be there, then discover that knowing arrived without any visible cue. The body starts receiving before the senses finish reporting. This does not mean you have entered another world in the dramatic sense. That language flatters the event and weakens discernment. What is actually breaking is your confidence that the physical frame is self-sufficient. The room remains the room, but it is no longer the only thing occurring there. The environment has become porous without becoming unreal. The soundscape changes with the same cruelty. Silence no longer feels like absence of sound. It feels like a medium. Noise remains possible inside it, but the silence carries more authority than the noise. A breath, a shift of fabric, a small mechanical click can suddenly feel distant while the pressure in the room feels immediate. This is not theatrical. It is invasive because it makes the ordinary hierarchy of attention collapse. The body tries to resolve the contradiction through motor control. You may become very still without choosing stillness. You may slow your breathing, not as a calming technique, but because the atmosphere seems to require less motion from you. The strange part is that stillness does not feel imposed. It feels like the most accurate response available. At this point, most people still believe the crossing is about what may appear. They think the climax will be visual, that the breaking of the frame is only a prelude to seeing something clearly. That assumption remains comforting for a little while because it keeps the event object centered. It allows you to imagine a being entering your space the way a person would enter a room. But the crossing is already disproving that model before anything takes visible form. The next insult is proximity without contact. Something is near enough to reorganize your field, yet not near in the ordinary sense of distance. You can feel closeness without direction. You can sense relation without location. This is where the physical frame stops being a container and becomes an instrument, because the room is no longer only holding bodies. It is transmitting gradients of presence. If you survive this layer with honesty, a second crisis begins. The question is no longer what the room is doing. The question is what your mind does when the room stops protecting your categories. Earlier stages allowed you to remain an observer. Crossing removes that comfort because the event is now occurring through your own registration. You cannot stand outside your perception and evaluate it from safety. The first temptation here is to overtrust yourself. You may think that because the event feels undeniable, your interpretation of it must also be reliable. That is the trap. Intensity in perception is not accuracy in meaning. Crossing pressures the mind precisely where it is most likely to become arrogant, because once the physical frame weakens, interpretation rushes forward to seal the wound. The second temptation is the opposite. You may decide none of it can be trusted because perception has become too strange. This looks humble, but it can be another form of escape. Total dismissal protects the ego just as effectively as total belief. It lets you retreat from the demand of developing finer discrimination. So the psyche enters a new kind of labor. It must hold an event that feels more real than imagination and less stable than matter. This is why crossing often produces delayed emotional consequence rather than immediate drama. You may move through the event with terrifying lucidity, then feel the aftershock later when you realize your old assumptions did not survive it. The mind grieves structure long before it admits that it has lost it. Fear changes quality here. It is no longer fear of being harmed in the conventional sense. It becomes fear of not being able to return to a simpler model of reality once the event is over. If something can enter your life without entering through ordinary space, then your previous trust in the world has already been altered. That realization can feel heavier than any visual encounter. This is why the crossing often triggers identity instability. You may begin questioning past experiences, not because you have gone irrational, but because the new event changes the scale of what earlier anomalies may have meant. The self that confidently sorted things into internal and external categories begins losing authority. In its place comes a quieter but more dangerous question. What else have you called normal simply because it had not yet crossed the threshold of your notice? And still, this remains only the inner cost. The relational cost comes later. Once the physical frame breaks, you are confronted with a possibility you were allowed to postpone before now. If presence can become semi-physical, then contact is no longer a theory of distant intelligence. It becomes an issue of access. What gets this close to a human system, and under what conditions? That question brings ethics into the room whether you want it or not. You can no longer treat the experience as private mystery alone, because proximity carries consequence. A distant watcher can remain ambiguous. A semi-physical crossing cannot. If something can alter your field at this degree, then your boundaries matter more than your fascination. This is where the earlier comfort breaks apart. It was easier to believe that readiness guaranteed safe approach, that coherence would naturally filter what entered your space, that permission was a simple shield. Crossing refuses that simplicity. It shows that access can occur before full understanding, and that your stability is not protection from ambiguity, but your only tool inside it. The event does not prove safety. It proves relevance. Now the body, the psyche, and the ethical field begin pressing on each other. The room broke first, then your categories broke, then your innocence about proximity broke. Once those breaks accumulate, the event stops being about whether a presence is there and becomes about whether you can remain intact enough to meet it without yielding your center. That is the real moment of crossing, not when contact enters the frame, but when the frame no longer decides what contact is. If you panic here, the event narrows into threat and you will spend the rest of your energy defending against what you have not understood. If you romanticize here, the event narrows into destiny and you will hand meaning to whatever stands nearest your hunger. Neither response is worthy of the crossing. The stage demands something harder. It demands that you remain in disciplined relation to what has not yet earned your surrender. So the moment of crossing is not the triumph many people imagine. It is not proof. It is not arrival. It is the loss of a simpler world without the gain of a final one. It is the point where contact stops being scenery and becomes structure. And once that happens, you are no longer being prepared to witness. You are being prepared to survive nearness without confusing it for truth. What part 1 allowed to remain intact, part 2 must now wound. It was still possible to think that the crossing meant something entered your world from elsewhere, that the physical frame broke because another presence stepped through it. That picture is too simple. The more dangerous possibility is that nothing had to enter at all, because the event was not about intrusion first. It was about exposure. You were not only sensing something near you, you were becoming perceptible in a way you had not been before. The room did not merely host a semi-physical presence. The room functioned as a condition in which your own field could no longer remain hidden from what had already been reading it. This reverses the comfort of part 1, because being approached is easier to imagine than being revealed. Approach still lets you think of yourself as the stable point. Revelation does not. This is why many crossings feel less like visitation and more like being found. The air changes, not because a door opens, but because concealment weakens. What you feel as proximity may partly be the pressure of your own interior no longer remaining private. That distinction matters because it changes the structure of fear. Fear of visitation is directional. It asks what is coming in. Fear of revelation is existential. It asks what in you is now visible, readable, reachable, and perhaps answerable. Once crossing reaches this layer, the event is no longer just spatial. It becomes reciprocal. The body processes this before the mind can form a theory. You may feel sudden honesty in the chest, as if self-deception becomes physically harder, not because they are interrupted, but because they are exposed as weak in the presence of whatever now registers you. This is one reason the crossing can feel morally charged even before anything visible happens. Exposure strips performance before it strips safety. And this is the first new fracture. Part 1 still allowed the belief that if you stayed grounded enough, the event could be managed as an encounter with a presence. Part 2 removes that comfort. The crossing is also an encounter with your own unreadiness. Your own hidden motives, your own private distortions now under pressure. You are not only meeting something, you are being met in the parts of yourself you hoped would remain untested. Once that reversal is admitted, a second layer opens. The event stops being about sight and starts being about memory. Most people assume the danger of crossing is misperception in the moment. The deeper danger is retrospective certainty. After the frame breaks, memory rushes in to repair continuity, and continuity is often a lie told too quickly. You may remember the room, the silence, the pressure, the sequence of turning and sensing and freezing, but the mind cannot tolerate a gap in ordinary structure for long. It begins smoothing edges. This means the event becomes more stable in recall than it ever was in direct experience. That false stability is seductive because it feels like understanding. This is why people often become most certain after the event, not during it. During the crossing, perception is raw and unstable. Afterward, narrative closes around it like scar tissue. The story becomes clearer than the event itself. That clarity is useful for survival and dangerous for truth. Memory here is not simple loss or inaccuracy. It is active reconstruction under identity pressure. If what happened threatens your old model of reality, your memory may minimize. If it threatens your self-image as rational, your memory may reduce. If it tempts your hunger for specialness, your memory may magnify. The crossing does not only break the frame of the room, it breaks the frame within which memory usually serves you faithfully. That is why some people report impossible exactness and others report haze around the same type of encounter. It is not always dishonesty. It is often the nervous system choosing what can be carried without collapse. The body can hold more event than the autobiographical self can integrate. What survives in narrative is sometimes only the portion your identity can absorb without splitting. The cruelty of this stage is that the more profound the event, the less likely ordinary memory will preserve it cleanly. You may retain one sensory shard with unbearable precision while losing the sequence around it. A gesture, a pressure line in the room, a tone in silence, a sense of relation without shape. These may remain sharper than the rest because they bypass the ordinary cataloging system. The mind then builds a scaffold around those shards and calls it recollection. This creates a second destabilization that cannot be dismissed quickly. If your memory of crossing is partly reconstructive, then certainty about what happened becomes structurally compromised. But compromise does not mean false. It means you must learn to live with an event that was real enough to alter you and unstable enough to resist full capture. That is harder than either belief or disbelief. At this point, many people try to restore control by privileging physical evidence. Marks, times, objects moved, environmental anomalies, witness corroboration. These matter and should not be ignored. But the crossing remains more dangerous than evidence can resolve. Because the core event is not only what occurred in space, it is what occurred in the relation between space, perception, and self-exposure. No photograph repairs that. Then the relational field changes again, and this is where part 1 must be cut more deeply. It was still possible there to imagine that nearness itself was the major escalation, but nearness is not the true break. Familiarity is. The most destabilizing semi-physical contact is not always terrifying because it feels alien. Sometimes it is terrifying because it feels known. A presence can arrive with a tone that bypasses defensive fear. Not safety exactly. Recognition. The body may react as though something ancient and already registered has entered range. That can feel like relief, and relief is far more dangerous than fear. Fear keeps you evaluating. Relief makes you permissive before evaluation is complete. This is why familiarity cannot be treated as evidence of benevolence. Trauma can feel familiar. Manipulation can use resonance. Internal fantasy can generate false recognition with stunning force. And something genuinely non-human may also carry an ancient pattern your system knows how to receive. The feeling itself does not settle the question. It only raises the stakes. So the third vector opens around consent, but now in a more ruthless form than before. Earlier stages let you believe that clarity of choice would remain available if approach became more direct. Crossing complicates that. If a semi-physical presence can arrive clothed in familiarity, then your no and your yes are both vulnerable to misreading, not because you are weak, but because the body reads familiarity faster than the mind reads ethics. This is how consent becomes non-linear in the crossing. You may not be forced in any obvious sense. You may not be physically overpowered. Yet your field can be softened, your defenses lowered, your categories rearranged by a presence that feels intimately known before it is morally understood. The old comfort that permission protects everything now begins to fail. Permission can be invited through recognition before discernment catches up. That does not mean all crossing is coercive. It means moral judgment becomes more complicated exactly where many people most want it to be simple. A presence can be precise, powerful, and even deeply familiar while still not being aligned for you. Another can feel almost empty of narrative and yet be cleaner in effect. This is why outcome becomes more trustworthy than sensation. What remains in you after the event matters more than how overwhelming it felt inside it. If the crossing leaves you less honest, more inflated, more dependent on recurrence, more contemptuous of ordinary life, then something degraded your coherence, whether it wore terror or beauty. If it leaves you quieter, harder to manipulate, less interested in performance, more exact with speech, and more serious about ethics than something in the event, even if only the pressure of reality itself moved you toward integrity. That distinction cannot be rushed. It must be observed across time. Now the three fractures begin pressing on each other. You were not merely approached. You were revealed. You were not granted a clean memory. You were handed unstable truth that memory would partially falsify in order to preserve identity. You were not offered simple choice. You were confronted with familiarity powerful enough to blur the line between resonance and permission. None of these can be solved by adopting a stronger theory. This is why the final third of crossing feels less like explanation and more like triage. You must decide what in yourself becomes non-negotiable before another event occurs. Not beliefs, standards. You cannot promise to know what a presence is, but you can decide that familiarity will not outrank ethics. You cannot guarantee accurate memory, but you can decide that confidence will not outrun evidence. You cannot stop revelation, but you can decide that exposure will not become self-betrayal. The body must be retrained under this new law. After crossing, regulation is no longer merely a wellness practice. It becomes boundary maintenance. Sleep matters because exhaustion makes familiarity more persuasive. Speech matters because dramatization poisons recall. Solitude matters because social reinforcement can harden a false narrative before direct integration has occurred. Ordinary life matters because it keeps the event from becoming your only mirror. The psyche must also accept a harsher discipline. It must permit gaps to remain gaps. It must stop using mythology, skepticism, or hunger as emergency plaster over a damaged frame. It must let uncertainty survive long enough that pattern can emerge from consequence instead of from craving. This feels like deprivation only to the part that wanted the crossing to become identity. And the ethical field becomes the true center, though it was hidden at first. Semi-physical contact is not primarily a test of bravery. It is a test of whether intimacy with the unknown can occur without the collapse of judgment. The crossing breaks the physical frame so that a moral frame can be forged under pressure. Without that, all nearness becomes dangerous, whether genuine or imagined. This is why the moment of crossing cannot be honored by saying simply that contact breaks the physical frame. It breaks innocence about reality, innocence about memory, and innocence about consent. It reveals that matter was never the only boundary, that recollection was never a transparent witness, and that recognition was never the same as safety. Those are not side effects. They are the real architecture of the crossing. If you can remain with that, without rushing to beautify it or reduce it, then something truer begins to form. Not confidence, Capacity. Capacity to be seen without surrendering self-definition. Capacity to remember imperfectly without lying. Capacity to feel familiarity without kneeling to it. Capacity to let an event be more real than your categories and still less authoritative than your ethics. That is the burden part one could not yet place fully in your hands. The physical frame breaking is not the climax. It is the beginning of a harsher literacy. Once crossing occurs, you are no longer being asked whether you can witness the impossible. You are being asked whether you can remain trustworthy to your own deepest standard, while the impossible learns how near it can come. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.